All right, so picture this with me. A tiny island nation in the Caribbean. Sun-drenched beaches, yeah. But also this incredible energy, like a revolution just waiting to erupt.
Hmm. Yeah, that pretty much captures Grenada in the early 80s.
This is a place, right, where history feels like it's happening right in front of you. Vibrant murals promising progress,
Yeah.
a young, charismatic leader who just like captivates people.
Maurice Bishop.
Yeah, exactly. It just, I don't know, there's this feeling of hope in the air, right? Like anything is possible.
It's tempting to get swept up in all that for sure. But the reality of Grenada's story, well, it's way more complicated than that. It's a story of Cold War tensions, internal struggles.
And ultimately, tragedy, right?
Yeah.
So before we get to all that drama, let's rewind a bit. What was life like in Grenada before the revolution, before Bishop took the stage?
Well, for most of the 70s, Grenada was under Eric Gary. And let's just say his leadership was, shall we say, a bit controversial.
Controversial how?
Accusations of corruption, brutality. There was a lot of discontent brewing among the people.
So the seeds of revolution were already being sown, huh?
Oh, absolutely. And that's where Maurice Bishop and his New Jewel movement stepped in. And they weren't just offering like a change in leadership. This was about complete societal transformation.
Yeah, I've heard Bishop described as like a truly magnetic figure. What was it about him that resonated so strongly with the people?
He was an amazing orator. I mean, the man could connect with people on such a deep level. But he was also a serious intellectual, studied law abroad, brought a fresh perspective to the island's challenges. He was like a symbol, a beacon of hope for a nation that was, really yearning for something better.
And then, in 1979, comes the coup. It's pretty remarkable that it was virtually bloodless. You don't see that very often with revolutions.
Right. It really shows you the level of support Bishop had built up. It wasn't so much a violent seizure of power as it was like this collective embrace of change. People poured into the streets, not out of fear, but to celebrate.
Must have felt like a truly transformative moment. So Bishop takes power. What were some of the big changes his government made? The stuff that actually impacted people's everyday lives?
They were really focused on social programs, healthcare, education especially. They launched these huge literacy campaigns, made a lot of progress in improving the lives of women workers. For a lot of Grenadians, these were tangible changes they could see and feel every day.
It sounds like they were making genuine progress. But I'm guessing it wasn't all smooth sailing, was it?
Well, you're right. Even with all the early successes, Bishop's government started facing criticism, and not just from outside, from within Grenada itself, too.
Let's start with the internal stuff. Were there signs of trouble within the revolution itself?
Yeah, there were some who argued that, while Bishop's government was progressive in a lot of ways, it was also getting more, well, authoritarian. They pointed to things like, suppressing dissent, postponing elections. Kind of looked like they were sliding toward one-party rule.
So those cracks were starting to show, huh? In that image of unity and progress.
Yeah, exactly. And those cracks just got wider because of the whole geopolitical situation at the time.
This was the Cold War, right? Peak
Mhm.
Cold War. And Grenada, even though it was this tiny island, got caught right in the middle of it all.
Right. Bishop's socialist leanings and his close ties to Cuba, that really set off alarm bells in Washington. You got to remember, this is the Reagan era. Anti-communist feeling was really intense, and the U.S. saw any Soviet influence in the Caribbean as a direct threat, like right on their doorstep.
So it's like this paradox, right? You have this revolution fighting for progress, for self-determination, but at the same time, they're dealing with all this internal tension and pressure from the outside.
It was a real balancing act, that's for sure.
And it sounds like an act that was about to come crashing down. Because, as we'll see, the biggest threat to the revolution wouldn't come from the outside. It would come from inside the movement itself.
A balancing act. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Bishop was trying to juggle so much. The hopes of his people, the challenges of actually running a country, and then the constant pressure from both the U.S. and Cuba. It was a lot.
And by 83, it seems like that act was starting to fall apart.
Yeah, things were definitely unraveling. And it all culminates in October of that year with what some have called a coup within a revolution.
It sounds like something straight out of a spy novel.
It really does. We're talking about a power struggle within Bishop's own party, a faction led by his deputy, Bernard Cord.
Now, we've talked a lot about Bishop, his charisma, his connection with the people. Who was Cord? What was he all about?
Cord was much more of a hardliner ideologically. I mean, he was a communist true believer. And he saw Bishop's attempts at pragmatism, like seeking aid from Western countries, trying to build a mixed economy. Cord saw all that as a betrayal of the revolution.
So a clash of personalities, for sure,
Yeah.
but also a clash of ideologies. Was this brewing for a while, or did it kind of explode out of nowhere?
There were definitely tensions within the New Jewel movement, but things escalated really quickly in the fall of '83. We actually get a pretty chilling look at those final days through the accounts of Decima Williams. She was Grenada's ambassador to the U.S. at the time.
Yeah, she had a front row seat to all this, didn't she?
She did. In her memoir, she talks about this growing sense of unease, like almost a premonition that something terrible was about to happen. Strange things happening. Missed phone calls, feeling like she was being watched, both in Grenada and at the embassy in Washington.
That must have been terrifying. To sense that danger was lurking but not know where it was coming from.
It was, and then on October 19th, Cord and his faction made their move. Bishop was placed under house arrest, essentially stripped of all power.
I can only imagine the shockwaves it sent through Grenada. I mean, Bishop was the revolution. He was the symbol of everything they were fighting for, and suddenly he's a prisoner of his own comrades. How did people react to that?
They didn't just sit back and watch. Thousands of people took to the streets demanding Bishop's release. It was this huge outpouring of support for the man who had represented their hopes for so long.
It's a powerful image, the people rising up to defend their leader, the very leader who some had accused of becoming authoritarian. So what happened next? Did it work?
Unfortunately, no. Things spiraled out of control. The protests, which started out peaceful, got more and more intense as the tension mounted. And then on October 25th, a crowd of Bishop supporters stormed Fort Rupert. That's where he was being held.
And this is where things take that really dark turn.
Yeah, the military, which was now under Cord's control, they opened fire on the crowd. It was a massacre. Scores of unarmed civilians were killed. And Bishop himself, along with several of his closest allies, was executed.
That's just a horrific turn of events. It really stained the legacy of the revolution in a way that can never be erased.
So what was the immediate aftermath? What happened to Grenada after that? The island was in chaos, Cord, and his faction tried to take control. But it was pretty clear they didn't really have a handle on things. And the international community, especially the Caribbean nations and the U.S., they were watching all this with a lot of concern.
And it's that power vacuum, that sense of instability that sets the stage for the U.S. invasion right now.
Exactly. What happened in Grenada might have seemed like this small, isolated event, but it quickly escalated into a major international crisis.
So Grenada's in chaos, Bishop's gone, the revolution is imploded, and you have this power vacuum, right?
Yeah, it was a really volatile situation, and that's the situation that Ronald Reagan walks into right at the height of the Cold War.
And Reagan was, well, let's just say he wasn't known for his nuanced approach to foreign policy.
He saw the Soviet Union everywhere, and Grenada, with its ties to Cuba, fit right into that worldview.
And that new airport they were building with Cuban help, that probably didn't help matters much either.
No, it didn't. It was easy for Reagan to frame that as a potential Soviet military base, a foothold in the Caribbean.
So he saw an opportunity to flex some American muscle.
And to send a message to the Soviets, to the region, that the U.S. was not going to tolerate any communist expansion in its backyard.
So on October 25th, 1983, just days after the massacre of Fort Rupert, U.S. forces, along with troops from a few Caribbean nations, launch Operation Urgent Fury.
A full-scale invasion of a sovereign nation. It was a bold move, a risky move. It just shocked a lot of people.
How did Reagan justify it? I mean, invading another country, it's not exactly something you do on a whim.
Well, publicly, the administration gave a few reasons. The main one was that they had to protect American citizens, specifically the medical students who were studying on the island.
Yeah, that was a big deal at the time.
Yeah.
There were all these images of those students potentially being taken hostage and played really well on TV.
Exactly. It created this sense of urgency, a need to act quickly.
And of course, they played up the whole communist threat angle.
Oh, absolutely. Reagan called Grenada a Soviet-Cuban colony, said it was being used as a staging ground for military power. He really pushed that narrative that the U.S. had a moral obligation to intervene to save Grenada from the communists.
But I'm guessing not everyone bought those justifications.
A lot of people, both in the U.S. and internationally, accused the U.S. of imperialism, of using a flimsy excuse to invade a small, weak country.
I imagine Decima Williams, Grenada's ambassador to the U.S., was not too happy about it.
She was furious. She condemned the invasion in the strongest possible terms, called it a violation of Grenada's sovereignty, a betrayal of the principles of self-determination.
So regardless of the reasons, the invasion itself was pretty quick and decisive.
The U.S. military was overwhelming. They encountered some resistance from Cuban troops and construction workers who were on the island, but they quickly took control.
Were there a lot of casualties?
Sadly, yes. There were losses on both sides, American, Cuban, Grenadian soldiers. And tragically, some Grenadian civilians were killed or injured too. It's a reminder that even when military intervention is done with the best of intentions, there's always a human cost.
So the U.S. takes control. What happens next?
They set up a temporary government, evacuated the medical students, and of course got rid of all the Cubans.
Did they stay in Grenada? Did the U.S. keep a military presence there?
Yeah, for a while, they helped rebuild some of the infrastructure, provided security, but it was definitely a period of American occupation, which created some resentment among the Grenadian people.
So from Reagan's point of view, mission accomplished, right?
In the short term, yeah. He got what he wanted, he looked strong, he stood up to the communists, and the American public was largely behind him.
But what about the long-term impact on Grenada? Did they actually benefit from this whole ordeal?
That's a tough question. On the one hand, the U.S. did provide a lot of aid for reconstruction, and Grenada's economy did improve in the years after the invasion. But the legacy of the invasion, it's still a really sensitive issue.
Some people were grateful for the U.S. intervention, but others saw it as a humiliation, a reminder that they were not truly in control of their own destiny.
Exactly. And it raises these really difficult questions about the role of powerful countries and the affairs of smaller nations, about when military intervention is justified, and about the unintended consequences of those actions.
It also shows just how complicated the Cold War was, and how these smaller countries often got caught in the middle of these superpower struggles. We've covered a lot today, from the idealism of the revolution to its tragic collapse, and then this controversial U.S. intervention. It's a story with a lot of twists and turns.
It really is. And it's a story that still resonates today.
Absolutely. For me, it highlights the resilience of the Grenadian people. They went through so much, the years of authoritarian rule, the chaos of the revolution, the trauma of the invasion, and yet they've rebuilt their nation, and they continue to strive for a better future.
It's a testament to the human spirit, our ability to find hope even in the darkest of times.
And for our listeners out there, I want to leave you with this. The Grenada story reminds us that history is rarely black and white. It's full of shades of gray, competing narratives, conflicting ideologies, choices that individuals and nations make. And as we try to make sense of our own complex world, it's important to approach history with nuance, with empathy, and with a willingness to face those uncomfortable truths.
If you enjoyed this deep dive into Grenada's past, we encourage you to subscribe to the show. We've got many more fascinating stories to share, stories that shed light on the forces that have shaped our world.